Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you can take your seats, please. Good morning. My name's Yiakoumi. I'm the group publisher of Automotive Logistics and the director of the Automotive Logistics Conferences. Welcome to the 16th Automotive Logistics Global Conference. And I think it's the largest and greatest yet. And that's appropriate, really, because it's an important time for the automotive industry. It's generally expected that the car industry will change hugely in the next few years. But one thing that is for certain is that whatever happens, logistics will continue to remain vitally important. But is logistics ready? Are you ready for this amazing future? Is the automotive logistics you're developing now going to be fit for purpose tomorrow? So for Automotive Logistics Global 2015, we thought we'd take the chance to stop and think a bit about what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we might do it differently. So that's the way we've set the program up for discussions to look at the future of your industry. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, our premier sponsor, Ryder, who have been our premier sponsor since our very first conference in Chicago in 2000. I wonder how many of you were at the very first conference in Chicago? I know there was a few. Yeah. So only a few left. Yeah. You're the old guys. Yeah. I'd like to thank our global sponsors, CHEP, CTM and Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics. They're called our global sponsors because they sponsor our conferences globally, all around the world. Our gold sponsors, Air Charter Authority, Air Charter Service, APL Vasco, SIVA, DSV, ICL, Jack Cooper, JDA, Landstar, Montway Auto Transport, Penske, ProTrans, Sergere, UPDS, and XPO Logistics. And our silver sponsors, who you can see listed around and in the programs. They sponsor our conference because they're showing their commitment to the future of the global automotive industry. They offer services, products, or knowledge to help you to reach your business aims. So please visit the exhibition area, meet their people, and read their literature. Also, maybe for the first time at our conferences, in the exhibition area, we've got a special area set up for one-to-one meetings. So we haven't arranged the one-to-one meetings, it's for you guys to arrange them, but there's some tables set out there where you can grab a coffee and sit down and have some more private meetings. Automotive Logistics is also one of our live events. A few people already have told me that the reason they're here is because they watched the stream of the conference last year, were somehow impressed and attended this year. But the live events isn't just for streaming the conference. It's about interacting within the event. So please, if you look at the front page of the conference program, you'll see a QR code, or in the program you'll see a section about how to connect to Automotive Logistics Live using your smartphones or your tablets. Because we'll be doing conference survey or voting surveys, which are always interesting and bring out some surprising results. You can interact with others in the conference. You can send direct messages to other delegates, and you can post questions to the moderators. We'll be able to see the questions or comments from the stage. So please, use Automotive Logistics Live. Log on to it, because I think you'll find it adds value to your experience at the conference. And I'm also often accused of being all talk. Me, all talk. In fact, JDA even had the cheek to give me a book called Supply Chain for Dummies. My first reaction was, surely everyone in supply chain and logistics are dummies, but present company accepted, of course. But I wanted to show you that we practice what we preach. So here's an example of a high-level, complex, lean, flexible, innovative, waste-free, and international supply chain using big data analytics to avoid disruption and for a perfect material and material flow and assembly system. You look and learn.
Sure. This is the Automotive Logistics Global supply chain at work.
Fully synchronized.
Fully synchronized, highly automated, most modern, cutting-edge technology.
I've just been in intensive training.
If only the OEMs could duplicate this, the entire world would be a better place to live. Thank you.
And these guys are not for hire, so please, I can imagine everyone making offers to become their heads of logistics. And for those who are wondering why you're here, I had a good conversation with a German car maker last night at the cocktail reception. They opened a plant relatively recently in the US, and he told me that 4 of their current logistics providers that they use in their plant now are a direct result of our conferences, that they met them here. So if you're a car maker or a tier supplier, or if you're an LSP with services to offer, then this is the place to be. So please use the networking opportunities, you know, the lunches, the coffee breaks, the rider-hosted dinner tonight, to share, to learn, to meet new people, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what this conference is all about. And we've been very lucky to have a great start to the conference. We'll be looking about what's happening to the industry, looking forward a little bit, how it's changed, and how it will change. We've got an analyst who will be presenting some forecasts for the industry. We've got a major global logistics company sharing on views on how the world has changed and will change again. And IBM will be discussing some of the main drivers of change over the coming decade. So I'd like to hand over to the first speaker of the day. I'd like to welcome to the podium Brandon Mason, the head of Autofacts for PwC. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you that are in town or from out of town, welcome to Detroit. It's certainly an exciting time in our city's history, and we're happy to have you here. Enjoy yourself. Don't get into too much trouble while you're here. All right, I thought I would frame the discussion this morning to start off and talk about some of the current trends that we're tracking within the industry, or at least current as of last week. I'm sure nothing's happened in the last week that is worth discussing. So we'll start off with that, and then we'll provide our outlook on the global industry, and then we'll close talking about North America and specifically the U.S. So the first issue I want to discuss is the impact of falling oil prices. This is our historic outlook at oil prices. You can see that right now, Brent oil is at about $45 a barrel. That's down about 55% from this time last year. So obviously it's had a significant impact on some markets, not as significant on others. The U.S. has been a great example of the impact because we have such low oil prices, low gasoline prices, and our fuel taxes are so low. It's had more of an immediate impact, not so much on the sales top line, but on the segmentation. And so as gas now creeps down to under $2.30 a gallon nationally, we've had a pretty big shift in segmentation. So year-to-date, alternative propulsion vehicles, so that's hybrids, electrics, plug-ins, fuel cell, et cetera, are down 17%. That's a pretty significant impact. On the flip side of that, though, we have pickups that are up about 11%. So that poses a bit of a problem to automakers. On one side, it's great because those are the high-margin products, and it makes automakers a lot of money, but it presents a problem down the road in terms of meeting emission standards. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with the U.S. emission standards, it's actually a dual standard, right? There's an on-road MPG standard, and then there's a emission standard that the EPA has set. So depending on an automaker's fleet, there's a different mix of light truck versus car. That's going to ultimately determine your unique mandate as an automaker. So for those companies that are selling more trucks, it's uniquely difficult, right? Because in order to improve efficiency on things like full-size pickups, we've implemented things like lightweighting, aerodynamics, engine downsizing, but you still have the need for torque and horsepower and other capabilities that consumers are demanding. So it presents a unique problem as consumer preference is starting to shift away from alternative propulsion vehicles because fuel prices remain low. And in global markets, I've mentioned this before, markets like Russia are highly volatile and highly susceptible to oil and gas prices. That's a big part of their GDP as part of their economy, so they've suffered as a result of that. I will say that nobody really knows where oil prices are going to go, but for the foreseeable future, and I say foreseeable future as within the next 12 months, because it's difficult to see beyond that for oil prices, we think they're going to remain fairly low. OPEC meets, again, I believe, in December, and they could finally decide to curb production then. Even though some of the OPEC markets have already started to curb production, you've got other non-OPEC countries like Iran and others that are continuing to increase production, so it's offsetting some of those OPEC production cuts. So will be interesting to see, but certainly has a big impact and presents a lot of problems for automakers in the near and long term. Thank you. The next issue is China, which has been often talked about lately, and the slowdown in that market and what's going to happen. What I'm showing here is our annual historical sales in China, going back all the way to 2004, and we've got year-to-date. So year-to-date through July, sales are up about 5.6%. What I want to illustrate here is that everybody just needs to calm down a little bit about the outlook on China. We've had low single-digit growth before. You can see as recently as 2011 there, we only had 2.2% annual growth. The Chinese government has already taken some proactive measures, obviously the devaluation of the yuan, greater lending. I know the PMI just came out for China, and it's at a 6.5-year low. Certainly, I mean, it appears that a slowdown is going to take hold. We still think that China is a 30 million plus market by the end of our forecast window. So when we think about this, we think about near-term impacts and long-term impacts. So near-term, yes, there is a slowdown. We're forecasting annual sales of about 3 to 5% growth. I think the more telling story in China is not so much the top line, which inevitably will continue to grow. It's the dynamic of the automakers within China and sort of this emergence of domestic Chinese automakers. The JVs that have the highest market share also have the most to lose. And so we've seen this emergence of domestic brands starting to take over some of the hotter segments like MPVs and SUVs. And we expect that to continue and the market to become more and more fragmented as we move through our forecast. So I would say not to worry too much about China. Obviously, there's some near-term bumps, but long-term we still see a solid growth in that market. Okay, the next issue I want to cover is the lack of Fed rate hikes. So we know last week the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, decided not to raise interest rates. We expected that now for the last few months. That was seen as the likely outcome of that meeting. They do meet 2 more times this year. They meet again next month in October, and then they'll meet again in December. We do think by the end of this year they will raise interest rates. This sort of sets up the discussion for our sales and assembly outlook in North America, which I'll get to here in a few minutes. But the really impactful thing is more the long-term play, right? Whenever the Fed decides to raise interest rates, whether that's next month or December or early next year, we're talking really marginal increases, so maybe 0.25%. But that's supposed to start off this, slight bump every few months or every quarter until we get to a more normalized level. And so the normalized level for the Fed rate is anywhere between 3.5% to 4%. We feel that that's going to have a significant impact on our U.S. sales outlook. And so our team did an analysis all the way back to 1972 and compared the effective Fed funds rate with the average prime auto loan interest rate. And what we found is, not surprisingly, there's a very strong correlation, about 82% correlation with an average variance of about 4%. And the math works out today if you think about the Fed funds rate being effectively 0 and the average auto loan interest rate for prime is about 4%. So if we carry that through what we expect to be a normalized level, and again, the chart on the right is slightly out of date. Obviously, the interest rate hikes are going to get pushed back a little bit now, but if you start to think about average prime interest rates between 7.5% and 8%, that really starts to take some folks out of the market. By and large, it's only the upper quintile average household income that are purchasing new vehicles in the U.S. anyways. So this excludes even some of the top quintile from purchasing new vehicles. And so this builds up, and we think it'll be around 2018 when we start to see a downturn in the U.S. market. But I don't want to ruin my future slides here. So obviously there's plenty of other issues going on in the world, but since I've got 20 minutes to talk, I thought those were the three that are sort of top of mind for our team as we get ready to release our Q4 forecast here in the coming weeks. All right, let's move on to our global outlook then. So this is our global light vehicle assembly forecast. The red shaded area is our assembly volume, the gray area is excess capacity, and then we have utilization tracked on the right axis, which is the yellow line. You can see this year we're forecasting about 89 million units of global light vehicle assembly. By the end of our forecast window, we're forecasting 109 million units. So pretty steady growth throughout the forecast window. Obviously, if we take a look at it from a regional perspective, the story starts to change a little bit in terms of who's contributing that growth. We're forecasting some 80+% of growth between 2014 and 2021 to come from what we define as emerging markets. So yes, that includes China, but that's also India, that's also ASEAN, that's also Brazil, that's also Russia. And obviously some of these markets, particularly the BRIC markets, have had some struggles here over the last few months and years. So again, we try and keep it in perspective as our near-term outlook is very pessimistic on those markets, but our long-term outlook by the end of our forecast window is optimistic as we think that pent-up demand in those markets as well as the economic situations will sort of right-size themselves, and there's still a lot of growth potential. What we show here is our contribution to growth within that top line by region. I think what's surprising to a lot of folks is that just how much North America is contributing. And we talk about Mexico and all the assembly going on in Mexico or the assembly growth in Mexico, but the U.S. is actually contributing more than Mexico in our forecast in terms of raw assembly volume growth. So good times ahead, we think, for the North American region. For South America, we actually had to take down our forecast by about 1 million units. We did this a few quarters back as the situation in Brazil continued to deteriorate. A lot of speculative capacity expansion with Indian and Chinese OEMs. In fact, some of the Chinese OEMs have actually closed their facilities in South America as again, that market continues to deteriorate. Some good news in the European Union, however, that registrations are up about 9% year to date. They're really starting to hit their stride now that the Greece austerity issue is behind them for at least the near term. Consumer confidence is up. Sales in the top 5 markets are up considerably as well. So we think that we're in a good stage for the European Union. We do think they'll have a downturn at some point as well, but there should be a little bit of a lag compared to when North America is going to expect it. I mentioned Eastern Europe, which is obviously largely driven by Russia. Russian sales are down some 20 to 25%. I mentioned sort of the double whammy of the economic downturn there. Obviously low oil and gas prices, but also the Western sanctions that have been placed upon them have really hurt the economy in that market. Middle East, Africa. Oh, can we go back a slide? Thank you. Middle East and Africa, that's largely driven by Iran and the baseline assumption, that there will be a gradual easing of sanctions within that market, and there is a lot of pent-up demand, particularly for low-cost vehicles. We often said that Iran is roughly the size of Germany in terms of the population, about 80 million people. So there's a lot of potential there and a lot of companies that are offering low-cost, entry-level vehicles that have an opportunity to grow global volume within that market. We have our Asias that are split up between developing and developed. I mentioned China, I mentioned India and the growth that we see there. India is actually, relatively speaking, the bright spot of the BRIC markets. As I said, Brazil and Russia are both down, China's slowing, and everybody's worried about it. India's had declines the last few years, but we're actually forecasting a year-over-year increase for India this year, which is certainly a good sign. But developed Asia-Pacific is Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Those markets we see declines throughout the forecast window. I mentioned Australia is going to be a 100% net import market by 2017 as the automakers that are in that market close up shop. And then Japan and South Korea are sort of realigning, the automakers in that market, realigning themselves to build where they sell. And North America is actually a large benefactor of that. Okay, from a country perspective, I think it's also telling, and you can see China. We're forecasting over 9 million units of growth in China. But if you combine the next 6 countries in terms of global growth, that equals the growth outlook for China. That's pretty telling of where the industry's at and just how large the Chinese market is, which is understandable why everybody's concerned in the interim, but we still, as I said, see very strong growth in that. So if you add up the next 6, as I said, you've got India, the U.S., Mexico, Thailand, Brazil, and Spain. That roughly equals the growth that we show in China. Very few markets we have a considerable downturn for. Obviously, we mentioned Australia and Japan. Canada also has some level of risk, although I would say this is from our Q3 release, so as we continue to work through the UAW negotiations that have been ongoing, as they begin to ratify their contracts, news inevitably starts to come out. So I imagine that my team and I are going to be busy here over the next week or two trying to figure out the implications of all the ratification agreements with the UAW. Okay, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. What I think is telling, this is our Alliance Group outlook. What I think is telling here is that for all the talk and need of industry consolidation, that we really haven't seen much at all in terms of the OEMs, and we really don't forecast there to be much consolidation in the coming years. So we've got our top 10 alliance groups that in 2014 accounted for 78% of global light vehicle assembly. The other alliance groups, the 56 alliance groups that we track, and most of those are Chinese OEMs, accounted for 22%. By 2021, we actually have the other alliance groups accounting for 24%, so more than they are today. And so by that measure, you can say that the market's actually becoming somewhat more fragmented, not less. And so again, we see very little consolidation on the OEM side. However, on the supply side, if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. We do see a considerable amount of transactions happening. This is actually pulled from our Strategy Ann's team, our supply chain consolidation study that should be available here in the coming weeks publicly. This shows total closed transactions in deal value all the way back to 2007. And for 2015, we're on pace for a record year, not in the number of transactions, but the value of those transactions. So for the first half of the year, over $30 billion in deals were closed on the supplier side. We're forecasting, based on what's sort of pending right now, another $18 billion to close by the end of the calendar year. That brings us to $48 billion, which is by far a record. But what's interesting is the number of deals have remained pretty static. We're looking at about 200 deals this year. But what's happened is the EBITDA margins, the multipliers have continued to rise as values for automakers have gone up in value as well. So if you're looking to sell, now would be a pretty good time to do so. We actually work on quite a bit, a few buy-side deals. And so the trends that we're really seeing it's a combination of two things, really. There's divesting of non-core assets. You've got some suppliers that are looking to get out of the auto business altogether or shed non-core components of their business in order to focus on what they consider core assets. But we've also seen a lot of transactions around actuators and motors and ECUs as we think about vehicle automation and the emerging trend there. And so those are really hot commodities right now, and we're seeing very high multipliers on those deals. So a lot of consolidation, I guess, is the key that I'm trying to convey here on the supply side. All right. Just a quick word on powertrain. So I mentioned it earlier in terms of the U.S., but obviously it's a whole host of technologies that are going to get us to meet the near-term and long-term standards, things like engine downsizing, things like alternative propulsion, although again, it's a difficult play right now when you give consumers a choice and oil prices are low. Sometimes you almost have to force their hand. So it'll be interesting to see how the industry copes with that. Advanced transmissions, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 speed transmissions are also a part of that. You can look at our alternative fuel forecast there. In 2014, all alternative fuel vehicles made up about 3.3% of the global industry. We're forecasting that number to hit about 6.7% by 2021. So more than doubling, but still a relatively small share of the market. In markets like the EU and North America and perhaps Japan, you might see a slightly higher penetration rate, again, driven by emission standards. But by and large, we see those as very incremental growth, and that the combustion engine will continue to dominate the automotive landscape for the foreseeable future. All right, so I want to transition now into our U.S. sales and North American assembly outlook and walk you through sort of what's driving our outlook there. So we just want to start off, and this is our North American sales top line by market, and you can see that, yes, in 2018, we are forecasting a downturn in U.S. automotive sales. So because the Fed didn't raise rates, or driven by one of the factors that the Fed didn't raise rates, we think we're going to have a really strong year in 2015. We're forecasting 17.1 million units of assembly, and then that's going to drive up to we think should be about 17.3. So this chart doesn't reflect, I think, August sales, which were, again, another strong month. But we do see a downturn in 2018, understanding that economic cycles dictate that there will be a downturn in the next 3 to 5 years. The question is exactly when and to what impact will we see it affect auto sales. So our team took a look at past recessions all the way back to 1963. And we also took a look at during those economic downturns. Again, an economic recession is defined by consecutive quarters of GDP decline. What was the peak to trough in terms of automotive sales during that same period? And those are highlighted in red. And then those peak to trough numbers are listed on the right side. And I think it's interesting. Obviously, the most recent recession was pretty catastrophic, right? Peak to trough decline of nearly 40% in automotive sales. But the industry is structured much more strongly now. We don't think that the next recession will have that much of an impact. We think it'll be more like the recession previous to that, which peak to trough declined only 4.1%. So if you do the math, that equates in 2018 to roughly a 5% decline in peak to trough. Obviously, it could be worse than that depending on how economic conditions work themselves out. But right now, the economy remains strong, so we think that as a whole, we're in fairly good shape to weather any recession. We also think it'll be fairly short term in terms of the length. So as we transition now, we think about assembly. Our assembly trend sort of bucks our sales outlook, and that we don't show any sort of downturn in assembly in the U.S. or North America. That's driven by a couple things. First is imports, and this is vehicle imports shown here. You can see that we peaked in 2009 around 27% of sales as imports. That's been on a steady decline ever since. In fact, we're trending at about 20 to 21% right now as automakers continue to localize assembly. And that's really driven by, move to the next slide, please. That's really driven by automakers from Japan, South Korea, and Germany. And so they still make up, those three markets still make up about 90% of total automotive imports from a country of origin perspective. But I think what's telling is if you look at some of the automakers that have set up shop in North America in the last few years, the impact that that's had on their import numbers. And so that's showcased on right. So this is by sales, the number of imports that each of these companies had in 2014. But if you look at companies that have recently set up facilities, like Mazda is a good example, their Salamanca plant. Nissan has their Aguas Calientes number 2 plant. Honda has their Celaya, Mexico plant. Pretty significant decline in imports. Other automakers are capacity constrained, and so we certainly see opportunities for growth there. And so if we move to the next slide, our team actually did a quick analysis between 2015 and 2021, both announced and forecasted assembly growth, and we split it two ways: new facilities and expansion of existing facilities. And we did a little analysis around how much of that would actually be impactful to import sales. And so by our calculations, there's going to be about 2.7 million units of added capacity between 2015 and 2021 in North America. Of that, we calculated about 84% would be consumed within the region. So the other 16% obviously being exports outside of the region. And then of that, we assume that the U.S. is going to have about 83% or account for about 83% of total North American sales in 2021. So again, if you carry the one, divide by whatever, you end up at a number of about 1.85 million units of import substitution for the U.S., which could cut imports up to 50%. And so I presented this in Baltimore at the Import-Export Conference, and I saw all the port folks, just their jaws drop, right? But I will say there is good news on that front. So if we can move to the next slide. So while we might lose some imports, if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. We do also expect exports within North America, from within North America to increase as well. And so as demand for large CUVs and SUVs continues to grow, the U.S. and North America in general is one of the sole-sourced plants for a lot of these products. And so you've got European OEMs like BMW and Daimler that are exporting over 50% of their volumes outside of North America. And we've seen recent investment announcements will continue to grow some of that capacity. These are just 5 plants, but these 5 plants account for over 50% of the non-NAFTA exports in the U.S. So there is good news on that front. We think we'll see a steady growth of exports outside of the region. And so what that all means, if we move to the next slide, is that our forecast is hitting 20 million units of assembly by the end of the window. and that's considerably higher than some of the other forecasting houses out there, but we do feel strongly that the import substitution, as well as the growth in exports, will continue to drive volume up. You can see even in 2018, as we hit a bit of a downturn in sales, that's going to continue to drive up assembly volume again as that localization of product becomes more apparent. So those are my prepared comments. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Good positive prospects for the global automotive industry, relatively positive for North America as well. Although, when we talk about troughs, we've learned our lessons, and the next ones won't be so bad. We've sorted out our industries. I've heard that a few times before as well. Yeah, that's the hope. Next up, to hear from a logistics service provider on what's happened and how the industry might develop, I'd like to welcome to the podium Bradley Jacobs, the Chairman and CEO of XPO Logistics.
Thank you and good morning. How are you? Good. That's great. I got a call from Louis about 6 months ago, and he said, "Do you want to come back and speak at the conference?" I said, "I'd love to. I'm kind of busy. I don't know if I can make it." He said, "No, you're going to come. I'm going to put you on the first panel right up. You'll have 500 people in the room." How could I decline that? I'm a ham. I like speaking in front of 500 people. He said, "But here's the catch. You cannot give a commercial, an advertisement for XPO Logistics. You have to talk about something deep, something stimulating, something entertaining, something that's going to change the minds of the group." I said, "I can't promise that. I can promise that I'll try, and I'll do the very best I can." So what I came up with was excerpts from a book that I and a very good friend of mine, Lucy Peterson, wrote, but never published, about 7, 8 years ago, when I was transitioning out of my previous company, United Rentals, and there's a rare moment in my life where I actually had some free time, and we wanted to write a book about, the title was, "The Most Important Things That Have Happened in the Last 13.7 billion years, asterisk, the Unauthorized Biography of the Universe." And the concept was, how do we look up what are the biggest things that have happened over the last 13.7 billion years, as far as we know? And how do you take the bazillions and bazillions of things that have happened and just pick out like enough that can fit into a book 1.5 inches thick? Turns out, what we thought was a very original idea was not very original at all, and there's a whole field called big history, and it was very easy to research this, just going on the internet and just reading books and papers. And so what we did is we just extracted from those different aspects of the recounting of big history from different fields and different points of view, and picked out what we thought were the most important things. I cannot summarize that whole book in 12 minutes, but I can distill it down to one work stream, one theme that was in the book that I think is very relevant to our industry, which is technology. And technology, I'm defining here in this presentation as tools, the things that humans use, the 100 billion brain cells we have in that 3 pounds of jelly, to create tools that make life easier and more efficient. So that's the kind of like a general concept I'm using for technology. Tools that the process by which human beings use their neurophysiology to create tools to make life better. And there have always been naysayers when it comes to new technology. Very few people look into the future of what the stream, and sometimes the trends are so clear, but we still don't agree with them. We just, for one reason or another, we have a bias of wanting to stay just what it is and refusing that things are going to change. And I used to be an oil trader decades and decades ago, and I trained lots of oil traders who went on to be very famously successful, and I'd like to take a little credit for their success afterwards, because I think I trained them in the psychology of oil trading, which is what happened in the past is totally irrelevant. The only thing you need to focus on is, what's the major trend? Is the market going up or is the market going down? If it's going up, go long something. If it's going down, short something, and focus on where it's going forward. People have a hard time doing that. I have a hard time doing that. And there's always people who when you show them the technological trends and how that's going to disrupt our life and change our business and maybe replace everything that we're doing and everything that we think is so important, people don't agree with it. Let me give you some examples on these slides. In 1943, Thomas Watson, who was then the chairman of IBM, said, quote, "I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers." That's a quote, Google it. Western Union, in 1876, thought that the telephone had, quote, "too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication." In 1830, Martin Van Buren, who was the governor of New York and went on to be president of the United States, thought that the speed of 15 miles an hour for railroad carriages was too dangerous and that people weren't intended to travel at such breakneck speed. And then Newsweek, in just 1995, was bearish on the internet and said, quote, "Even if there was a safe way to spend money over the internet, it's missing that most important ingredient of capitalism, salespeople." So, truth in advertising, I didn't find these quotes. I got these from my good friend John Larkin, who's the hardest working and very influential analyst at Stifel Nicholas covering this industry. And I found them very relevant to the presentation I'm about to give. I also think what's relevant is a quote that one of my esteemed and highly respected competitors, who out of respect and courtesy shall remain nameless, said last year, "An app wouldn't be able to handle all of the intricacies of freight transportation. I don't fear being put out of business by an app." Well, I do, because I think that Google really does have a chance, not a certainty, but does have a chance that as things evolve, they disrupt the OEMs, the Tier 1 suppliers to the OEMs, the 3PLs, the 4PLs, and all the carriers. And I'll develop this theme as we go through the slides. How many people can actually read the slides? Okay, good, because it's important to see them. You'll see a lot of dates, and I'm just picking out 2 or 3 things from each slide that I think will illustrate the point. So let's start with the history of technology, which I'm pegging at about 2 million years ago. Forget the 13.7 billion. Boom, let's just go to 2 million years ago, when the first stone tools were made from split pebbles. When Lucy and I did our research, we couldn't find anything that fit the definition of technology, using the 3 pounds of jelly in the brain to make tools to make life easier, more efficient. Using that definition, that was the first thing we could find. 2 million years ago, stone tools were made from split pebbles. There was 1 million years between those first stone tools and the next major technological development that we could identify, fire. And of course, fire was huge, many game-changing applications, including getting more nutrition from cooked food and the health benefit, the longevity from that, to lighting and heating the environment, to warding off predators. So fire was a big one. But notice as we go through the slides that it starts off 2 million years ago. The next big thing is like 1 million years later. And as we go through the slides, there's a real clear trend here of they're coming faster and faster and faster and more impactful and more impactful. So about 500,000 years later, about 500,000 years ago, man built the first shelters. Global trading started about 100,000 years ago. Then lots of inventions started coming out of Asia, and China in particular was extremely creative. You had the abacus in 1000 BC, the first coins around 635 BC, and the compass and gunpowder a few hundred years after that. The time gap between inventions then starts speeding up even more, and in 1440, big invention, the printing press. It was the next big thing at the time, and it was a very big thing because it gave us the ability to transfer information and to communicate with everyone else on the planet very widely, very efficiently. It was the beginning of mass communication. Transportation, very relevant to this conference, began in a significant way in 1662 when Blaise Pascal invented the public bus, and that was 6,000 years after the wheel, but only 200 years after the printing press. And this was quickly followed by the invention of the steam engine, what we could now call the genesis of intermodal. 100 years later, Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity, and 6 years later came the first self-propelled road vehicle. And here the pace of transportation technology developments picks up quite a bit. The first steamship made the first transatlantic crossing in 1838. In 1839, Charles Goodyear developed a way to make rubber tires. Now in 1876, another big one, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. In 1885, Daimler invented the first four-wheeled automobile. And soon after, Rudolf Diesel invented the diesel engine. In 1896, Daimler built the first truck. 1908, huge year for transportation. You had Henry Ford use the assembly line to introduce the Model T auto. The Wright brothers achieved the first airplane flight. And just 2 years later, customers trusted planes to ship their freight when a plane transported commercial freight for the first time. In 1914, barely 6 years after the introduction of the Model T, electric traffic lights were invented. In 1936, a rail provider transported a truck trailer for the first time, the origin of container transportation. And the pace again starts to pick up even more with bigger, faster technological developments. 1937, Frank Whittle invents the jet engine. 1940, England uses the first operational computer in World War II. The United States gets in on the technology action, rolling out a general-purpose computer in 1946, and the first commercial jetliner in 1949. 1955, 19 years after rail first applied the container concept, the first container ship is built. Notice that rail adopted the containers before ships. Computer technology is getting better, more compact. The silicon chip in 1959, the mini computer, 1963. Xerox develops the first PC, the first personal computer, in 1973. We take it for granted, PCs. They haven't been around that long. And then computers infiltrate a multitude of applications. Mobile phones in 1981. It was a new thing in 1981. I had one of the first mobile phones. It was about this big by this big by this big, had a huge antenna. We put it in the car. You had to dial for about an hour before you would get through, but it cost $4,000 something, which then was a lot of money, and it hardly worked, and it was a great conversation piece. And it evolved now to these little tiny smartphones that we have. 1983, Microsoft Windows, big invention, as well as GPS technology for civilian use. The 3D printer was invented in 1984. Now the pace of technological innovation snowballs. Email, 1996, after Microsoft had just rolled out Windows 95 the year before. 1997 you had the predecessor to text messaging, instant messaging. Remember AOL IM, as well as video phone technology. And in 1998, Google was formed, quote, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, unquote. Just 17 years ago, IBM introduced the first speech recognition software, which today, of course, has evolved into Siri and Dragon, and the ability to talk to your car to make phone calls and talk to your car to get directions. And technology then started to get social. Facebook launched just 11 years ago. YouTube followed in 2005, literally just a decade ago. 9 little years ago, saw the first tweeted. Touch technology was introduced just in 2007 with the iPhone. The iPad was introduced just 5 years ago. And today, the most recent technologies that I think are most relevant to this conference include wearable technology, autonomous vehicles, advances in 3D printing, drone delivery, machine-to-machine communication, and the Internet of Things. So a really exciting time to be living. We're at a point where for the last 2 million years, humans have been using their brain to develop more and more technology. The technology has been getting better, it's been getting faster, become more impactful, more social, disrupting, changing, and faster, smaller amounts of time between new inventions. Fast forward 20, 30, 40 years ago, and think about everything that each of us do in this room, whether we're manufacturing things, whether we're shipping things, whether we're handling the logistics in facilities, whether we're a 4PL, a 3PL, everything that we're doing has a strong possibility of being disrupted by that thing that was predicted not to have legs to it, the internet. And at XPO Logistics, which is the only time I'm mentioning it, so there's not a commercial for XPO Logistics, but I have to get a little plug in. We are now moving about 90,000 shipments a day globally. And pro forma for the Conway acquisition, that'll go up to about 150,000 shipments a day. And our goal is to embrace technology, keep spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year in technology, have the brightest minds thinking forward, futuristic, thinking objectively about what could be disrupting us, and get ahead of that curve. And that was my attempt at making a stimulating 12-minute presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad, for a great stimulating presentation. Although it did make me feel old when I suddenly realized the things that weren't available not so long ago. And I'm nearly 40. You guys must feel really old. But the other important thing was at the beginning of the presentation, I have a lot of meetings around the world, meeting different car maker executives. And I do sometimes think it's full of naysayers. You know, when we talk about what might change, what might develop, there just seems to be a kind of a dismissal. Yeah, that might happen, it might not, it won't affect us. I do think we've got to have that forward-thinking mentality. And talking about forward-thinking, really looking a bit more forward, I'd like to welcome to the podium Cal Gyimesi, the Automotive Marketing Leader from IBM Analytics. Thank you, Cal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being invited to speak here. And it was great going through that whole history of technology. And I saw IBM mentioned a few times. Our business has changed quite a bit from some of the things that were listed on there. Last week I was at the Frankfurt Motor Show, and somebody actually came up to our booth and wanted to know where all the servers and the storage units and all this stuff was. And hardware has become a very, very small part of IBM's business now. Our business is about software, it's about helping our clients, it's about services and the like. And one of the things that we do to better understand these clients, to be able to serve them better, is we do some independent research that we publish, both to show our clients that we understand the industries that they're in, and also for us to guide us in how we should be investing in the solutions of the future. So what I thought I would take you through is a study that we released just a few months ago, where we took a look at how the automotive industry might change over the next decade. And the study's called Automotive 2025, and we titled it Industry Without Borders, because the borders of this industry are coming down all around, especially as the vehicle becomes connected, as the Internet of Things is growing all around us, as was just mentioned. It's sparking the way for all sorts of new companies to enter in and figure out how to make not just automotive revenue, but transportation revenue, and we're seeing that from companies large and small all around. So let's see if the clicker's working, and it is. Good. So in this study, we talked to about 175 executives all around the world in 21 different countries. And we spent probably about 250 hours in discussion interviewing people. And you can see sort of a breakout of the different parts of the industry that we spoke to. We wanted to get outside the industry as well. So in addition to the OEM suppliers, what I titled the distribution chain, which is the dealers and the captive finance companies and such, also a whole bunch of new entrants that are trying to figure out how to make automotive revenue. We do these studies globally, so we have our account teams that are in many of the big automotive OEM accounts and supplier accounts, and as well as others, go out there and conduct these interviews, and then we synthesize the results and publish them. So this study is available, and I'll have a URL on where you can find it at the very end. So we called it Industry Without Borders, and we found 3 big disruptors that we feel are causing the industry boundaries to blur and to even disappear. First is the consumer. The consumer is becoming increasingly sophisticated, very sophisticated. They expect greater digital engagement with all of the different companies that they that they decide to give their business to, whether it be banks or insurance companies, but also auto companies. And auto companies aren't used to the type of digital engagements that other industries have perfected over the last decade and a half or 20 years since the internet rose. Consumers can be compelled to co-create and to participate in helping you develop your products and your strategy. And that has to become a core competency for auto companies, is to be able to pull that consumer in, or different types of consumers for different purposes. I'll talk about that in a little more. Second, in this area of mobility. So mobility taps into a couple of things. One is intelligent vehicles, and the capabilities of these intelligent vehicles are changing how people want to move around. And secondly, we're going to create, auto companies are scrambling to create new services that are driven from consumer requirements, and you see those popping up all around us. And finally, the ecosystem. It's going to enable some new paths to enterprise growth, different from what they were a few years ago. And I'll contrast a little bit a study that we did about 6 years back, which also attempted one of these future studies. So I have some comparative data about how the industry felt about growth from a few years back. And then finally, there's going to be some new opportunities both to collaborate, both with traditional partners and with some very new partners. And auto companies have to really make the ability to collaborate and partner become a core competency for them, because as the industry borders come down, the traditional path of working with suppliers is going to change to having to work with peer-level partners, and they won't be able to have the same types of supplier relationships, perhaps, in some of those cases. So let's start with the consumer. I took a few slides out because of the time frame that was given, so I'm just going to touch on the consumer a little bit because it's a little further away from the logistics part of the business. But 73% of industry executives expected more direct collaboration and co-creation with consumers. So in every part of the business that we asked about, you can see everything but the token vehicle assembly down there. Every other part of the business, there was considerable interest in finding ways to tap into consumers and to use that power of the crowd and to draw in different types of crowds. There's a tremendous power in large crowds of people who you can collaborate with very quickly. There are some small startup auto companies that are becoming very, very good at it and are starting to grow quite a bit. And they're able to tap in very enthusiastic crowds to help them in their vehicle design, to help them even develop manufacturing processes and such. So this becomes in every part of the business, tapping into the crowd and figuring out systems of engagement. This has to become a core competency for automakers. Different types of crowds you want different types of engagement for. Around vehicle design and such, you may need more expertise, and there are companies that have become very good at tapping into smart young people, retirees who are experienced in vehicle design, other types of enthusiasts who want to join design communities and participate. When you look at a marketing type of crowd, you're not so discriminating perhaps in the types of skills that people might have. You might be looking to try to amplify a message and use the power of the crowd to create some buzz and to create some attraction to your products. So the ability for different parts of the organization to tap into crowds and exploit that crowd and to get different types of information from it has to become a core competency. Let's move to the vehicle. Already, connected vehicles are all around us. Over the next few years, almost every vehicle that's going to be sold will have varying types of connectivity to it. And what we see is that the more sophisticated technology that there is in a vehicle, the more difficult the HMI has to be around it, and the more difficult it is for people to be confused and to only use a fraction of the capabilities that that vehicle has. Or it's the same has been true for the consumer electronics industry for many years. So we think the next bogey to chase is going to be this idea of a self-enabling vehicle. The idea that consumers will be able to keep data about themselves and their preferences, and analytics will look at the history of that consumer and the history of that consumer with your products and be able to use that to begin to self-integrate and to self-enable these vehicles. So we broke out this self-enabling vehicle into 3 components. One is about taking care of its occupants, where we talk about self-integration of devices and about consumer data. Second is about configuring this car automatically without the consumer having to, or the user having to deal with many different buttons and different interfaces. The second part is around taking care of itself. So here the vehicle is going to be self-learning. It'll maybe make adjustments based on your driving patterns and give you feedback on your driving and take into account weather conditions and things like that. And secondly, self-healing. So the vehicle is rapidly being able to recognize when there's something wrong with it. All of the electronic data that's being generated off the vehicle is being analyzed continuously, and eventually vehicles may work toward being self-healing. And then finally, working well with others. And here we talk about self-socializing and eventually self-driving, being automated and autonomous. Self-socializing, we already have mandates out there for vehicles to be able to share information amongst themselves with vehicles in a similar proximity. Vehicles within a certain brand may want to be able to share information about problems that exist with it in order to help each other. And then vehicles will also obviously communicate with a larger traffic infrastructure. So this self-enabling vehicle, we feel, is the next big thing to chase after all vehicles are connected as they are now. This changing landscape is also affecting a larger mobility ecosystem. Mobility is a word that is just growing by leaps and bounds, and every auto company and others are trying to figure out how to not just sell you a car, but offer different types of mobility services. And we just came back from Frankfurt Motor Show last week, and there's enormous buzz around trying to find new business models and finding new ways to increase the utilization of vehicles and for people to share vehicles. In previous times that I've been to Frankfurt, everything is about all the big presentation of cars. But this year they had a huge hall that was dedicated to the new mobility world, basically was the name of that hall. And it had a number of vendors of different kinds, telematics providers, mobility providers, and alternative transportation providers that were in that hall, attracting people and bringing them in. So that hall was routinely pretty crowded, and this was the first time that they had that at the motor show. When we look at the vehicle, if I look at the columns, I'm looking at the vehicle, multimodal options, and other types of ancillary services, and I'm contrasting them with what the user may want from a vehicle perspective, from a driver convenience perspective, and from an occupant perspective, and we put a variety of different types of services that a user might pursue in these different cross-sections. The purple in the upper left is really the only thing that the auto companies have traditional control over by selling you a car in the traditional way. So all of these other types of services that a consumer may want in figuring out how they can best move around is coming through different growing mobility businesses, making acquisitions, or is being provided by other providers who are trying to push their way into the consumer through your phone or through other means in the vehicle. Finally, the last area was around the ecosystem, and one of the things that we asked the executives that we spoke with is, where will industry growth come from as you think out over the next 10 years? And you can see some of the choices there that we gave them, and the number one choice that they selected was collaborating with other industries. So they're recognizing that they need to push their way outside the traditional industry and begin to work more aggressively with other industries in order to be able to grow. Creating new service-based offerings, top 2 answers there. And you can see what's at the bottom of the list here. Things like entering new markets, which was top of mind when we did this survey about 6 years ago. The red and green arrows on the right side represent the difference, the percentage difference in this study versus the one we did 6 years ago. So you can see that collaborating with other industries, creating new service offerings, that's really where a big change in how versus how the industry thought about it 6 years ago. You can see the big negatives, the reds at the bottom, entering new markets, targeting new customer segments, creating new product categories, the traditional ways that automotive companies typically had grown in the past. Those have fallen into greater disfavor versus some of these new ways to think about growth. We also asked about ecosystem disruption and how it's going to be, where is the greatest areas for ecosystem disruption of the traditional ecosystem. So retail channels was the #1 answer, 71%. Marketing and sales, 60%. So recognizing how consumers are changing and the need for those parts of the business to change to respond to consumers. Supply chain ended up more near the bottom at 48% in the global survey. But when we break that out, there's quite a bit of variation in that number. And OEMs and dealers thought about supply chain in a very traditional manner, but suppliers and then these new entrants really thought that supply chain was an opportunity and logistics was an opportunity for them to be able to disrupt the marketplace. And when I think about new entrants, I'm thinking about mobility providers, I'm thinking about telematics providers, mobility operators, I'm thinking of companies that are now maybe in the sales brokering new vehicle sales, but also have big ideas about the downstream movement of vehicles and how that can be optimized, and are beginning to experiment with some pilots in doing that. So that may be an area where some of the new opportunities for logistics fall as we think out over the next decade. Finally, we asked about, at the very end of the questionnaire, we asked about how prepared they felt that they were for the changes over the next decade. And only less than 1 in 5 felt that they were prepared right now for the changes that they were going to see. So there's tremendous need. There's a burning platform for organizational transformation and for finding new ways to work within the ecosystem. And most executives acknowledge that there's still ways to go in their companies. And thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Cal. Some very interesting presentations there. Cal, that gave us a look at the future. I don't think there was anything that was too surprising there. And that's, not complaining about Cal there, but I think we know some of these things are happening. What was more concerning for me was the last slide, that we're not ready for it. We're not preparing for it. 20% of things that we kind of know are going to change. And I said just after Brad Jacobs' presentation that when I have meetings, it's full of, naysayers. So I think there's a lesson for us. The world will change. It's not, we heard from Brandon, the kind of things that we expect to change, maybe the forecast that we heard. We expect that. We kind of prepare for those, but we don't prepare for the game changers. We're not ready for the game changers. And we heard, in the history of the gajillion of years, how many things change and how they've been changed, how they were changing every million years, every 100 years, and now these new things, new ideas seem to be changing every 10 minutes, it seems like. So we really need to prepare for how the automotive industry is going to change. So this is the chance for you to ask some questions, to make some comments. You can do that using Automotive Logistics Live, but preference will be given to those in the room. So if you've got a question or comment for any of the panel members or just a general comment that you want to make, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and then say your name and your company name, and then we'll take the question. So we've got a question from a young chap at the back there.
Yeah, this young chap was at Louis' first conference in Detroit, and he was the same height as me then, and I guess it's wearing more on him than me. A couple of comments. Firstly, I think I've never come to a more complimentary session from 3 speakers in all the years I've been coming here, so I really enjoyed that session. Thanks, guys. Firstly, a comment as well for Bradley. You put your history on there and technological advances. The one that I keep getting when I'm at home is when my kids talk to me and say, "What do you mean you used to have black and white TV? The world's in color." And they don't seem to understand that things move on. But anyway, in terms of the industry, you all mentioned about the Internet of Things and the effect that this is going to have. I've been reading certain reports as I've been doing my own research for Jodis, and looking at how the Internet of Things is going to affect the future. And there's a lot of information around about SAVs and PSAVs and what that's going to do to the industry, with some forecasts saying that these are going to take ownership of vehicles in the Western world down from an average of 2.1 cars per family down to maybe 1.1. And possibly even having an effect of up to about 30% downturn in economic production for OEMs. Any comments on that?
I know what a UAV is, drone. What was the other one, SAV?
Shared autonomous vehicles and public shared autonomous vehicles.
Well, my personal opinion is yes. I think there's going to be definitely going to be driverless trucks. There's definitely going to be driverless cars. The question is when. There's lots of big companies, including a handful of big companies right in this room, who are spending billions and billions of dollars on R&D to develop that. It'll have a huge impact, positively, I feel, on the economy. It's going to take a lot of cost out, a lot of inefficiency out, and decrease accidents as well. There's risks. There's going to be kinks that have to work out. Have to be worked out. There's regulations. There's cyber security issues. There's criminal. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to get worked out before that happens. But that could happen in 10 years. There could be I was at a town hall meeting in Joplin, Missouri last week with a bunch of truck drivers, and they asked me, "So, what about our future?" And I told them very frankly, I think your future is really bleak, because I think eventually you're going to be replaced by driverless trucks, but that's probably a decade off, and you'll have a chance to retire by then, because most of them were about my age. But I do think that's coming. I mean, is there anyone in the room who doesn't think there's going to be driverless trucks and driverless cars? So it's unanimous. Everyone agrees.
Thank you. Brandon?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly there's an outlook and an expectation that technology is going to continue to grow in terms of market share. We just put out a study called Reinventing the Wheel, and it looked at potential disruptors, and this is sort of a follow-up to our 5 megatrend study. So we've always said that that's a potential disruptor in the auto industry. So if autonomous vehicles and things like car sharing and ride sharing become more and more prevalent, what's the impact on global automotive sales? So we counter that with, we've got growing populations in emerging markets. We've got an emerging middle class in countries like China and India. And so those are somewhat offsetting. We have another trend like urbanization, where autonomous vehicles, we think, in urban areas would probably be a first mover, as opposed to more wide open rural areas. So I don't think there's any question. I mean, everybody, I think, broadly agrees that yes, this technology is here, it's coming, going anywhere. But I think the rate of adoption is the big unknown. And so we certainly don't think there's going to be any disruptive market share of autonomous vehicles within our forecast window, but I would say even within the next 10 to 20 years. And we're not being a naysayer. I'm just saying that we see a very slow rate of adoption for those technologies, because there's, quite frankly, a lot of hurdles to overcome before we get there.
One thing I would note is, I don't remember if it was 2011 or 2012, I spoke at NASDAQ, and I think it was in Orlando, and I made that prediction that there's just the same thing we just all discussed and agreed on as a room full of professionals, that autonomous trucks and autonomous vehicles in general are coming. And it was met with complete disbelief and ridicule. It was like in the movie Back to the Future, where the guy goes back to the 1950s and plays rock music in front of everyone, and then all the people from the 50s are just staring and no one's moving. It's so strange. It was the same kind of reaction. And here, 4 or 5 years later, we all agree that it's coming. So I think it's probably coming faster than we think.
Yeah, I think it's coming reasonably fast as well. But one of the things that we did as a follow-up to this 2025 study is a companion piece that we're going to publish in January. That is a consumer survey of the top 16 automotive markets. And I was actually I was going into it. I was sort of in the camp that the industry is going to disrupt very rapidly, and the things you're talking about are going to really change the industry. But preliminarily, one of the findings that we have out of this is that consumers are still very enthusiastic about owning a car. And I expected them to be a lot more ready for different types of ownership models than they appear to be. There was still a strong aspiration for owning cars. So I kind of changed my mind a little bit about that from that data.
I would think another technology might be an even more potent disruptor to auto manufacturing, and that is high-definition virtual reality. So meetings like this, at some point in the future, reasonable people can disagree whether that's in 5 years or 25 years, but sooner or later, there won't be a need to have these kinds of meetings because we'll have technology that will simulate this exact kind of meeting, and in fact, we'll be able to transfer information and make connections with other people more thoroughly without having to leave our home or get into a car or a plane.
I've just been complaining about naysayers, but I said that will never happen. Question at the front here.
Good morning, Chris Ludwig, Automotive Logistics. Question for Brad. I guess in the context of some of this disruption, needless to say, XPO has been buying up some companies and maybe we see some consolidation. Do you think that consolidation within the logistics sector is kind of a way to prepare ahead of some of the changes we might be seeing, whether it's technological or market?
I definitely do, because in order to prepare for disruption, you have to be innovating. You have to be doing a lot of R&D. You have to be spending lots of money on projects. Some may work out, some may not work out, but then you get some real killers that give you a big edge, endear you more to the customer, take inefficiencies out of the customer supply chain. And you have to spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year to keep it fresh and keep it alive. And what was fresh a year or two ago is not fresh anymore. And you can't do that if you're a small company. So I think one of the main advantages about being a much larger company and consolidating the industry is that you can afford to do that kind of stuff. My vision of where I think the industry is going hasn't changed at all in the last 5 years. I think this industry is the last industry that has not been consolidated yet, but should. You look at all the other big swaths of the economy, the industries are mature, and you have 2 or 3 players that have 75%, 80% of the market, and they have big distinct advantages over the smaller players because of their heft. I think that's where this industry is going as well.
Thank you. Any questions? There's one in the middle here. From the old gentleman in the middle there.
Old gentleman. Just a clarification question for Brandon. Did you mention when you were talking about the trend line for the Fed rates that the new car market really is only around the top 20% of the income bracket?
That's correct. If you look at the average household income for new cars and light trucks, and then match that up, and we broke it down by quintile for the average household income in the U.S., it's really just the upper quintile that are purchasing new vehicles. That's correct.
Okay, so I don't want to be a Luddite. I'll just be a skeptic. We're really talking about technology and all these things for the top 20% of the income bracket, or income distribution. And I think you're talking about North America or the developed world, or the U.S. specifically.
Yeah, we're talking about U.S. specifically. So that was in relation to our U.S. sales outlook. Okay. I mean, the average transaction price of a vehicle right now is approaching $33,000. the average transaction value of vehicles are going to continue to rise as we think about safety, fuel efficiency, and consumer demand things like electronics. So that's going to continue to take folks out of the buying population, compounded by higher interest rates.
Okay. And so we might even see with this rapid rolling out of new technologies and capabilities that the actual price of cars is going to go up. It's not going to go down, which means that the new car market potentially will get smaller. What I'm getting at is that I accept the argument about how rapid technology is developing and being fielded, but it's not necessarily doing things that maybe are socially beneficial away from the Facebook kind of definition of social networking, and that is making mobility accessible to other segments of the population for whom car ownership, because home ownership is no longer feasible for them. Car ownership becomes the major accomplishment. That's the way that you become an adult, is you buy your own car. And it frees you, certainly in our society, to be able to do things. And I really believe in the power of the developments we're talking about, but not a single negative side or potential downside has been identified. And just when you talk, Cal, about the power of the crowd, if the crowd turns on you, if you're an OEM and you get something wrong, today it goes from bad to worse to disastrous in an incredibly short period of time. And are you looking at the downside as well as the upside of this kind of evolution?
Yeah, I mean, in our role, I mean, we're not analysts, so we're not as much looking at that. I mean, but I mean, the week of news has seen some of what you're talking about. You know, that certainly has happened. You know, actually to Brendan, I wanted to tie it back to the first question. If only, because I had the same thing on my mind as we were giving the answers to the initial question. If only the top 20% or less are able to buy new cars, really, won't mobility models have to accelerate where people can have access to vehicles without having to be buying them, be buying them?
Well, 2 points to make sure we consider. One, that model is specific to the U.S., which is, by far the richest economy in the world. Global, and we talked about global growth, over 80% of our forecasted assembly growth is coming from developing markets where we think lower cost vehicles will play a more important role. And back to the U.S. part of it, there's been mechanisms that automakers have used to make prices more affordable. Obviously, leasing is at an all-time high, so you can get very affordable leases right now on vehicles. The other part of that is we've seen more and more entry-level products come into the market, both on the non-luxury and luxury side of the business. So compact, subcompact. So they're sort of rounding out the lineups to offer some consumers more options as vehicle prices continue to rise. So I think those two points are starting to help prop up U.S. sales.
I would comment on several very important things that you said. One is, does technology increase mobility? And step back for a second and just wonder, so why do we want mobility? What's the purpose and driving factor behind people wanting to leave their house, get in a car and drive to go somewhere else, or to use a truck or another form of transportation to bring something to them? It's to fulfill, I would think, basic needs like food. And if there's something that develops in science and medicine to replace food, that's going to disrupt transportation quite a bit. People get in a car to go places, to go to work. Do you have, in the future with technology, will you have to go to work? Can you stay at home? Will you have to even do that work? Can we have computers do all the work for us? We can just have fun and enjoy life. It's to connect with people, whether it's family or friends or new connections that people want to make. We're social beings. We enjoy doing that. Do you have to leave your house and get in a car to go do that in the future? Maybe, maybe not. So that I don't know how important it is to be mobile in the future. And with respect to the downside of technology, totally there's a big downside, because I agree with you completely that the effect of the communications aspect of technology worldwide means things happen real fast, good and bad. And if you look at some of the most evil things and horrible things that are happening in the world right now, like ISIS, who have a psychology of, I believe this, this, and this, and you have to believe this, this, and this, which many of us have those two sets of beliefs, but they have a third set of belief that says, and if you don't believe what I believe, then I have to kill you. So that's a really very terrible sequence of beliefs to have. They would have not been able to convert the tens of thousands of people to buy into those sets of beliefs without the internet. They have enormous amount of Twitter sites and Facebook sites, and they're recruiting people all around the world right here in the United States through the internet. So there definitely is a downside to that. And all the technologies that we're developing, criminals will embrace that. Evil, I shouldn't say evil, but governments that don't look at the world necessarily the same way we look at the world will use that, like North Korea and China and Russia have done with cyber terrorism here in the United States. And then with the other point that you mentioned was, so what's some of the advantages of technology? For me, maybe the biggest component and advantage of technology is the ability to transfer information, to share knowledge, to educate each other so that all these things that we're learning in one part of the world don't get stuck with the haves, but can get to the have-nots. And I read something the other day that showed a poor African boy with a young kid. I don't even think he had clean water and clothes, but he had a smartphone in the middle of some poor African country, and it said that young boy had more knowledge and information in his hand with that smartphone than President Kennedy did as the president of the most powerful nation in the world back then. It kind of so there are some serious, profound advancements being made and benefits.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's been a very exciting session, very positive. Looking forward, there's going to be some huge changes. We've just talked about the disadvantages. But I think the thing that's going to really impact the automotive industry in 10 years' time, or not I think, the thing that will impact the automotive industry in about 10 years' time, we've got no idea what it is. It hasn't even probably been thought of yet. Probably like 10 years before the iPhone, who thought, wow, the iPhone's really going to impact our world, or so I think the thing that will impact us the most, we've got no idea what it is. But I hope it's exciting. I hope it involves a lot of supply chain and logistics. And I sure as hell hope it involves people having to go to conferences to talk about it. So I'd like to thank our panel for a great opening to the conference. The sessions are splitting in two now, so please take your things with you as we split into a finished vehicle logistics session on waste and a parts logistics session on waste. But please join us in the other room if you go to the end of the corridor and turn right again for our coffee break hosted by Sergey. Thank you.